Hello, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the first session of the fourth day of the conference Kropotkin. So we have another series of amazing panels today. This first panel will be in English, while the following ones today will be in Portuguese. So, hoje a primeira mesa em inglês, as seguintes vão ser em português. So I think that we can start with the presentations. Then there will be the possibility for the public to ask questions in the YouTube chat line. So the first presenter today is Sam Brown, who is presenting on the importance and the limitations of objective scientific knowledge to ethical matters through examining the unfinished work on Peter Kropotkin on ethics, alongside more recent work in the fields of anthropology, primatology, and neuroscience. Please, Sam, 15 minutes for you.
Thank you. That is a working title, to be clear. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Yeah, it's there. I can't see both windows at once, so can I?
But
okay,
we can see it.
Great. So yeah, my presentation is focusing on Kropotkin's work, Ethics, particularly as we can see it from today, 100 years after his death. As many of you probably know, this was his last work and the one that he had not completed at the time of his death, and that was published posthumously. So it is a work that is sort of in stasis. It's something that he didn't get to finish. So for the first part of this, I'd just like to discuss what his aims were with the ethics and what he was able to complete, and then what he was not able to finish while he was alive. So the main goal of his ethics, and the most impressive sounding to us, I think, would be that he wanted to evolve a sort of ethical theory that would be somehow adequate, would have the same power as all of the other scientific developments that we've had in the recent centuries of human history have had. That would essentially be the counterpart, the thing that could guide humanity now that we've developed our powers to such a great degree. Now, even in his time, we had unlocked enormous discoveries. We essentially discovered the basis of chemistry. We could identify these same chemical elements in distant stars. And we finally understood our biological origins as a species. We're no longer simply created and put here by a god or what have you. We could understand these things. So what he was trying to do was to come up with a theory of ethics that would be worthy of its moment, that would be worthy of these discoveries that we've had about the physical universe, that would somehow be able to guide us now that we have this knowledge. And that would itself be scientific, that would be rooted in the same knowledge that I'm discussing, this scientific knowledge of the universe, which without any sort of ethical dimension could perhaps be somewhat empty, just knowledge without a meaning for us. So as well, these scientific powers that we've unlocked can be incredibly destructive. not the least in warfare, including the First World War, which he saw in his lifetime. And moreover, the ethical theories of his day, and I would say, generally speaking, to our own day, were stuck in a kind of dilemma, where we were trapped essentially between, as he put it, between Kant and Nietzsche, but that generally and more broadly stands for, on the one hand, religious dogmas of the past, and then on the other hand, a sort of atheism. Nietzsche called himself an atheist, for instance, but a sort of view of atheism, a view of nature, a view of the world that was supposedly demystified, but that was actually very bleak and had a view of nature as a very cruel and uncaring place, a social Darwinist view. So what did Kropotkin finish? Essentially, most of the work of ethics that we have now is a very robust historical review that builds on his work Mutual Aid. So there's some things that echo Mutual Aid.
Sorry, Sam, we can only see the first page of your presentation.
Oh, really?
Okay, now...
Should I just do this?
The fourth one. Okay, now it seems that it works.
Okay, I'll just keep doing this then. You. Great. So, what he completed essentially was a historical review of ethical theories, as well as it was building on his work Mutual Aid. So there's a lot of discussion of nature, of anthropology, of so-called primitive societies, of their relationship to nature, to animal life, their understanding, which he was aware of the sociality of animals, informing their own understanding of sociology, and the vision of sociality as being throughout nature. So, in a sense, actually, Kropotkin is not so much discovering things as he's rediscovering things that our civilization, the civilization that he was a part of, we could call it Western civilization or European civilization at the time, things that had been lost, a sort of awareness of our social nature, the social nature of animals, and our, the social nature of the world, really. But most of the work was just a historical review of ethical theories of Europe. I mean, after he got done with discussing primitive societies, he turned to ethical theories of ancient Greece, of Rome, and then of later European thinkers going through the Enlightenment and into the 19th century. And this was unfinished. So he did not get to really critique Nietzsche, nor did he get to critique Stirner, and there's no sort of constructive part to the ethics, which is something that one would expect, like that he would eventually finish this historical review of different ethical theories of the past, of how different societies saw things, of the rudimentary forms of ethical instincts in animals, that he would take all of these data and that he would create a sort of encompassing constructive basis for thinking about ethics scientifically. So for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to try to do that critique of Nietzsche that he was not able to do, and do a sketch of what that constructive part might be, but with reference to the knowledge of our own time, with the anthropology, the neuroscience, the primatology of our own time, just to see if we can have a sort of sketch of that, but one that would be relevant to us. So, as far as Nietzsche goes, the main thing that Nietzsche is wrong about is his anthropological view. He views morals as originating in this thing called bad conscience. He views morals being basically a result, an echo of cruelties visited upon humanity by conquerors of the past, his blonde beast, as it were, these master races. Nietzsche viewed these as the creators of history, and that morality, these things were the creations of the weak and the powerless to try to restrain the powerful and the conquerors. And that ultimately society itself is just this sort of thing. It's a tool that the weak use to control the strong. But this is a fantasy, and it's a fantasy that is very common in European thought. And even to this day, scientists sort of debate about, an anthropological view of like what humans are before civilization. And they debate between this sort of noble savage of Rousseau or this violent war of all against all of Hobbes. But both of these things are on the wrong track. They're incorrect because they're based on the idea that society is a human invention. Hobbes thinks that society is a human invention that's imposed by a Leviathan. Rousseau thinks it's something that's rationally figured out as a social contract between noble savages. But the truth is, and it's a very simple truth, society predates humanity by millions of years. It is not something that humans came and decided to make one day. And Nietzsche suffers from this same delusion. He thinks society is something that was basically imposed on individualistic, violent, aggressive, essentially crazy warrior types who did not live in society before that. So here's just a quote from the Genealogy of Morality. Nietzsche says, the process that spurred the invention of morals occurred when mankind finally found himself imprisoned within the confines of society and peace. But society, peace, these things existed long before there was this thing called humanity. There's society among apes, there's society among our distant ancestors. So it's not something that humans existed outside of at any point. So, to be fair to Nietzsche, there's something worthwhile, and I think Kropotkin would perhaps agree there's something worthwhile in his critique of the mendacity of Christian love, and its relationship to, if not basis, in resentment. As well, there's some good aspects to Nietzsche, his approval of the bold and daring individual, appreciation for the world, something that certain religious views have caused to be diminished, seeing the world as like inherently not a good place. Nietzsche was passionately against that, and I think that is admirable. But he associates these things because of his bad anthropology with this kind of pure sadism, where the true nature of humanity is to be aggressive, sadistic, and just simply not have any sort of ethical compunctions. So, to cap off, Nietzsche should be also criticized not just on these anthropological things, but also on his own terms. And so to that end, I'll just read this. What is more powerful, to destroy or to create? Which is more dangerous and more rewarding and full of possibilities, to destroy an enemy or to make them into a friend? Which is a sign of greater strength, to manipulate and tread on the weak, or to help the weak, let alone teach weakness how to be strong? So that's it for Nietzsche. Now, I'll start with this sort of sketch of an ethical system, air quotes, adequate to the present, maybe, in sort of Kropotkin's manner, based on his sort of views. So I'm going to start out with some preliminary things that he sketched, because though he didn't get to this constructive part of his ethics, he did say things in his introduction and in the various conclusions he reached that give you an indication of where he might be going with his ethical ideas. Not just describing nature, not just describing past societies, not just describing past ethical thinkers, but where he might be going with his own proposals, his own construction, his own ethical, you could call it a system. He uses this word, at least in my translation. So first of all, commitment to truth. He says inner contradiction is the death of all ethics. And with that, he was referring to the contradiction of the religious ethical thinker who believes that we are all equal before God, who believes in perhaps universal love, as advocated by Christ, supposedly. But then you look at the world around you and you see that clearly this is not present and the church isn't exactly helping. Another thing is that ethics should be active and not reactive. He says in the introduction that he does not want to dwell on humanity's sins, but to push it, if possible, in a positive direction. Not a fetter to individual initiative. So Kropotkin is not simply communistic in this sense where he doesn't think that the individual has a role. In fact, he is alive to the idea that the individual is a powerful motive force in history. And also, he doesn't just want to describe the origins of ethics, but to impart why they are so important and to make you feel this sort of ethical obligation. Not simply describe it, but to actually live it, to actually feel what it is that ethics makes people feel, ideally. And not to give in to what he calls the bankruptcy of science, which is not his phrase, but something that was announced during his time, where people thought that science would not be able to answer certain questions, period, and therefore it should be dispensed with. He says, no, we need to make use of what we know about the world. So here's this general scheme of how ethics, morality is developed in natural history. It starts with mutual aid among animals. As that develops, even among animals, there are rudimentary ideas of justice, meaning fairness, equality among the members of a species or a community. And then finally, this develops in humanity and in some animals into something even higher, where there's the possibility of altruism, self-sacrifice. And in humanity, of course, this takes the highest form, where it's not even related to kinship or whether you're sacrificing for, genetic relative or anything like that. But humans are able to we're able to sacrifice ourselves for ideals and for people we haven't even met. And he wants to understand, how is this possible? And not only that, but how do we advance this project? So, on top of all this, I should mention, because he is so reliant on science for his understanding about ethics, that there is also an ethics behind science, which is an implicit part of his own. So that's uncover and communicate truth, or an approximation of the truth, because science might never be the exact truth, but always simply an approximation. And another value that you could say science has, or has had historically, is the role of truth in fighting dogmatic authorities. So I just gave Galileo as one example, but there are others of scientific thinkers who basically, through their discoveries, overthrow authorities and have to challenge authorities. So, bringing Kropotkin to the present, many of his ideas have stood up remarkably well. He's referred to approvingly by contemporary scientists. I'm going to be talking about Robert Sapolsky and Franz de Waal's work. They're primatologists. Sapolsky is an endocrinologist as well. Franz de Waal is mainly a primatologist. There's also a great essay by Stephen Jay Gould called Kropotkin's No Crackpot, and he's a great science writer, so I suggest, if you're interested, check out Stephen Jay Gould's essay on Kropotkin as well. So basically, evolution can indeed explain the origin and development of our ethical impulses, and now, through careful ethology, study of animal behavior, we have done so in more detail. So here's just a list of social instincts in animals. From the simplest to the most complex is where I'm going here. So we start with something very simple in fish, like herding instincts, where fish gather in numbers, which makes it easier for a single one of them, any single one of them, to be picked out by sharks or predators or what have you, because they're all hiding amongst each other. Less primitive than that in mammals is the maternal instinct, which starts developing in very primitive mammals. You know, mice have this instinct. Our long ago ancestors, probably more than 100 million years old, had maternal instincts, and these sort of form the basis of further evolution of ethical instincts. So among mice, rodents, there's emotional contagion, mutual grooming, affection, and helping. So this is an example from a paper that was published in 2011. Basically, rats, when given the option between saving a fellow rat or eating some chocolate that's been left out for them, will actually go save their companion, or at least will not eat all of the chocolate until they save their companion. And this is something that until it was discovered, this pushed back essentially our view of when empathy and pro-social behavior began to evolve by millions of years, because this had not been observed in such supposedly simple creatures. So more advanced instincts, and these things are present in monkeys. There's what Frans de Waal, the primatologist, calls community concern, meaning monkeys will break up fights, and it's just for the sake of breaking up the fight. They get in the middle of the fight, they break up the fight. It's not that they take sides in the fight. It's not that they're trying to win one.
Sorry, Sam, I think that
Yes?
you are going out of time. Can you please conclude?
Okay, sorry, I couldn't see the clock, so okay, I'll wrap it up. I'm getting close to the end, and then hopefully we can revisit, I guess. Community concern, reconciliation, and fairness for the individual are things that monkeys will engage in. They'll complain if someone's being unfair to them. If you go to great apes, then you'll find that, for instance, they will actually work for fairness for somebody else, as in if a situation is unfair to somebody else, they will try to amend that. And they also they are able to take someone else's perspective when they're helping them. So whereas monkeys cannot actually, they can feel distressed by something else's distress, but they can't necessarily take the perspective of another thing and do what is appropriate to take care of them. They don't have the cognitive capacity to do that, whereas great apes do have this ability to do what to help other members of the species, or even other species, according to their own situation. So as far as the fairness for thee goes, there's this story that Frans de Waal gives in the Age of Empathy book. Bonobo is given a large reward, and then she's being watched by other bonobos, and then she'll stop eating the reward and gesture to the researchers until they give similar rewards to the other bonobos. Otherwise, she won't eat it, because she doesn't think it's fair, essentially, as far as we can tell. So I'm running out of time, so I can't really get into this right now, but maybe we can talk about it. But there have been discoveries in neuroscience that I think Kropotkin would have loved if he was around. For instance, mirror neurons, where the same neuron will fire in your brain if you do an action yourself as when you see someone else doing the same action. It will activate the exact same neural system in your brain. Really interesting and food for thought. Then there's this thing called culture. I'm just going to briefly describe the Kikorok troop, baboon troop, because it's really interesting. But this mirror neuron thing, the ability to mimic things and to imitate and to spread behaviors, not through genes, not through inheritance, but culturally, has interesting effects. So baboons, just for starters, they're very nasty, aggressive apes. They're very male-dominated. It's a terminant species is the biological term, where few males compete to have access to as many females as possible. And generally, they're extremely aggressive. So what happened to this one specific troop, the Kikorok troop, or the forest troop, in Africa in the 80s, basically, the most aggressive males of that troop, and only the most aggressive males of that troop, were accidentally poisoned by some tainted meat that they found in a garbage dump, and they died. And what happened to that troop was they, with only these sort of lower ranking, less aggressive males around, and many more females than males, they transformed into a much more relaxed baboon culture, meaning that there was a lot less fighting, a lot less infighting, a lot more grooming, a lot less stress, and they actually measured the stress levels of these baboons, their cortisol levels, and the baboons were actually doing much nicer in this sort of like pacifistic social way than baboons of other kinds. So it's not that simply the genetic makeup of a baboon determines what its behavior is. There's also apparently a cultural element. So we should understand that, like, even something, you know, much socially perhaps more simple than us, like a baboon, is mentally actually pretty flexible and has a sort of cultural capacity to it. And if that's true for baboons, it's so much more true for us. And I guess I'm running out of time, and I can't really go into the anthropological dimension of this. I would just say nomadic hunter-gatherers should be distinguished from other forms of hunter-gatherers if you're trying to understand the deep past of humanity, because we were specifically nomadic hunter-gatherers for most of human existence on the planet. And nomadic hunter-gatherers, at least, if you stick to them, this is true. If you include other kinds of people who are sometimes classed as hunter-gatherers, this will not be true. But if you look specifically at small nomadic hunter-gatherer bands, they are relatively very peaceful societies that engage in war very infrequently because they can't afford to do it. And a good book to read on this score is The Old Way by Elizabeth Marshall Thomas. It's about the Quasi-Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert, and it'll give you an idea of their culture. And I think I just want to put that book out there. Can't get into that. So what about the future? So Kropotkin was inspired in his ethical views not simply by, you know, ethical thinkers, not simply by the deep past, not simply by nature, but by the political events that were happening around him. So the Paris Commune, if you go back a bit further, the French Revolution, these are things that Kropotkin saw as, in fact, more important to ethical progress than anything that he can put in a book, because he realized that books, theories, are not what change things in the world. And when he started his project on writing ethics, he was clear that it can only clarify certain things, but the movement itself is what is ethically transformative. And that's what you should look to if you're interested in the ethical issue. I've just put this quote from George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia here, because I think it's one of the many quotes in that book that give an idea of just the sort of ideal that we're going for as anarchists. And that Kropotkin, I mean, let's remember, this revolution was inspired in no small part by his writings. So Orwell says, up here in Aragon, one was among tens of thousands of people, mainly, though not entirely of working class origin, all living at the same level and mingling on terms of equality. In theory, it was perfect equality, and even in practice, it was not far from it. There's a sense in which it would be true to say that one was experiencing a foretaste of socialism, by which I mean that the prevailing mental atmosphere was that of socialism. Many of the normal motives of civilized life, snobbishness, money-grubbing, fear of the boss, etc., had simply ceased to exist. The ordinary class division of society had disappeared to an extent that is almost unthinkable in the money-tainted day of England. There was no one there except the peasants and ourselves, and no one owned anyone else as his master. Of course, such a state of affairs could not last. It was simply a temporary and local phase in an enormous game that is being played over the whole surface of the earth, but it lasted long enough to have its effect on anyone who experienced it. And yeah, I'll just close with my attempt to sum up what an ethical vision based on the sort of scientific understanding might sound like. And I'm sorry if this translation isn't good. I kind of rushed it. But our home, the earth, has become a hive of devouring slavishness. Millions of years of slow transformation, which our care for each other won out over our individual inclinations to gain by hurting each other, and thousands of years of struggle to comprehend our real situation outside of our imagined stories, and thousands of years of struggle to survive and resist the cruelty of arbitrary powers that have grown up. These things have made you who you are and have given you everything you need to give in your turn to the struggle, the only struggle that can resolve these problems and achieve a world where our joy is not surrounded by so much pain. And that's all for my presentation. I'm sorry if I've gone over. I could not see the clock from.
Okay, thank you, Sam. Thank you also for the bilingual PowerPoint. This was very appreciated. So, considering that we are short of a presenter, and also now for fairness also to the other speakers, I think that we can allow, if you want, up to 20 minutes, something more than what it was defined for the next couple of presentations, hoping that we will anyway have some time for discussion then. So next presenter is Joff Bradley, speaking about philosophy and the corruption of youth. Please, Joff.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share, hopefully I can share something. Here we go.
Yeah.
Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. Just to give some context to this, I read Kropotkin when I was a teenager, so it's going back some time now, and Kropotkin's always stayed with me. And what stayed with me, apart from things like Mutual Aid and those great works, was his plea to the young. It's a very short essay, and it's always, for some reason, it's been with me. So it's a great opportunity, and I really appreciate the chance to come and talk about Kropotkin. I don't think I've ever given a lecture on Kropotkin before, or a talk or a presentation. So it's really fascinating for me to talk about Kropotkin. And how I did it was, I was thinking about Kropotkin's speech to young people, okay? And this was at the end of the 19th century, okay? And then I was thinking about a contemporary French philosopher called Bernard Stiegler, who sadly died recently. And I was wondering about how Kropotkin's plea to youth, how would it be understood in our moment? And, well, would his concerns be the same as Bernard Stiegler's? Bernard Stiegler talks much about youth and about uncontrollable societies. So I wondered whether this idea of a universal sense of race and nation and things like that, how it would be somehow eclipsed by our, what can you say, our kind of immersion in digital or technical relations. So I was wondered, would that idea of elevating ourselves beyond our kind of the harsh aspects of our nature, whether that would be possible. So of course they did speak in different times, and of course that means that the object of question and criticism was different. And I was wondering whether Kropotkin's kind of humanistic goals, whether they would just be, they wouldn't be heard by the youth of today. Youth would be indifferent to this kind of, this concern with universal goals. So, and I was wondering whether the other side of that, whether it would speak to them, to young people. It would speak to what Stigler calls the blank generation, a kind of generation given over to the drives, which means there's a society without desire. Okay. So I wonder, anyway, that was my project, and I published on this, and anyway, it was very easy to write about in the end, and I really enjoyed speaking about it and writing about it. So I was thinking about that, the real concern Stigler had about youth like imploding and suffering all kind of psychological illnesses, and the hope kind of given to youth by Kropotkin. But both of them were speaking, it seemed to me, towards the future, what youth could become. The not yet, you could say the not yet of youth. And that would be a question of maturity, how youth would come to maturity. I've been writing about Hegel and the question of maturity in Hegel as well. So they seem to go together in some ways. And anyway, in the end, I began to think about the philosophical importance of corruption. I don't mean corruption is like some sense of perversity. I mean the corruption, which means that a kind of corruption of corruption, as Badiou might say, that brings youth to raise a kind of a question of a criticism of the order of society. That would be my kind of, that would be my project, the corruption of corruption, to make youth rise up and question the way things are and the way things, how they should be and what they could become. So that, anyway, that's what I was writing about, and I'm going to keep this talk short. So I just chose one or two quotations, which at first, anyway, that was my comparison just between Kropotkin and Stigler. But then I just picked upon, I think there's three things I found. One was invention. Invention is very important for someone like Bernard Stiegler. He's concerned with making digital tools or technical tools, which are a kind of pharmacological possibility, which means to say that we must use our kind of immersion in technology in a curative way to cure, okay, and to care. You could say cure and care. So anyway, Kropotkin picks up on this very interestingly, and as it says here, he talks about youth who trying to make an invention, okay, to increase production, you could say, and youth who work constantly to make to invent, okay. And then what happens as a consequence is that people are thrown out of their jobs, and well, you could say people are thrown out of their jobs, and the cheapest person, the cheapest worker, is given the work, and those workers become mere machines. So this is very important for someone like Stiegler, who's talking about the robot revolution to come, and what does it mean to invent in our time? What does it mean to invent in our time, and for what reason do we invent? So this was what I found something similar taking place when I read The Appeal to the Young again. This idea of invention. Why is that important? It's important because Kropotkin was speaking to those tender of heart, okay, and saying to those of tender of heart who have a concern with the world as it is, to ask them, what inventions are they making? Are they making an invention just to just to make money, just to increase their property assets? Or are these inventions for the betterment of all? And in what way can an invention change the way people become mere appendages to machines? Mere machines, as he says. And in what way can, when we invent, what does it mean when we invent that we become thinking beings? What does it mean? We invent, and the consequences is that those people who live in drudgery are somehow become elevated, become sublimated, you can say. Their desires are raised, and they can become thinking beings. Very important for the idea of building a new society is we need people who are thinking beings, okay, who do not suffer toil day in, day out. So I was thinking about this, and then recently, of course, we have these billionaires like Branson and Bezos who've shot out of the planet, and people like Elon Musk who dream of inventing these wondrous ideas like a ring around the planet of satellites and a Neuralink and things like that. Rockets, which we've become tourists, shooting into space. And all around us, millions and billions of people live in poverty. So what are these inventions that these super rich people create, and their ignorance of the plight of billions of people around the planet? So I think Kropotkin would be concerned about those kinds of people. He would be concerned about the people who make the YouTubers, right? Or the people who want to make a quick buck from an app which captures our attention and things like that. And that's why Stiegler is important in this regard. He's talking about the way that we become addicted to technologies, and what kind of inventions are those that keep us in a state of funk for months on end, and what kind of thinking beings are those that are created? They're not thinking at all, they're non-thinking beings. What does that mean for youth as such? So that was the way I tried to connect those things together. And then I turned to the kind of philosophy in the end, and Kropotkin talks to the philosopher. Who is this philosopher that lives in a time, just his time is like ours, where people are enslaved by two machines, whether it's in the factory in his time, or it's in Foxconn now around the planet, or it's or what is the role of the philosopher who looks upon the world and sees people enslaved and suffering? And then I thought, yeah, there's something between Kropotkin and Bernard Stiegler in this respect. So it's not just a call to youth, it's a call to those who are thinking beings, like the philosopher, to respond to the corruption of society by speaking to youth and demanding the corruption of corruption, as I kind of mentioned a moment before. So this was Kropotkin speaking to the philosopher who kind of just wants to be removed from society and doesn't want to think about the plight of billions of people around the planet. And then this is where I'm going to, I guess this would be my last slide, so I don't want to kind of take people's time up, but I kind of tried to make a comparison to try and explain what I was thinking about. So again, the appeal to youth would be an appeal to those who are tender of heart, who have compassion and care for others. And what Stiegler sees, and this is point one, I guess, Stiegler sees, he has two examples. One is the 15-year-old teenager called Florian, who says, we are the last generation, we have no future, we are not going to get married, we're not going to get a job, this is the way of the world, we live in desperate environmental disaster, we live in the Anthropocene, and the world is approaching a kind of end time. Then more recently, he looks to Greta Thunberg, who speaks truth to power, who in an act of parasia, who risks her very young life as a teenager to say this is wrong the way that we live. So Kropotkin, I think, would soon befriend someone like Greta Thunberg, And this is the idea of corruption of youth, okay, speaking truth to power. So there's a wonderful comparison there between Kropotkin and Stiegler. As I said, point 2 would be the idea of thinking being. That would be the question of desire, the question of sublimation, the creation of a new society. And contrast that with what Stiegler calls the la bête immonde, the hideous beast, or what Felix Guattari would call the capitalist bachelor machine. Those people who act out the drives. You can think about the terrible acts of violence in some of the schools around the planet, like a Columbine would be an example, right? Sandy Hook, right? Where young people just act out violent tendencies. That means that there's a lack of vulnerability to the other. You can't have a society which doesn't care for the other, right? And point 3 would be, as I mentioned, the idea of the worker as a mere appendage to the machine. So there's a Marxist criticism you can find shared with Kropotkin there about people becoming mere machines. And contrast this with what Stiegler calls the proletarization of knowledge, which is to say that people lose skills of how to make and how to live and how to philosophize or whatever. And then he goes to Aristotle to look at the loss of the noetic mind. That's the mind that is a thinking mind or a thinking being. And point 4 would be about the dream of a society beyond capitalism, about beyond the Industrial Revolution in Kropotkin's time. And that, again, would be a concern, a dream of an ecology of dreams, as Stiegler calls it. That would be a struggle with the faculty of reason. Reason is in crisis for someone like Stiegler. We live in a society of unreason. And then a concern, as I said, about the acting out of the drives in violent tendencies, or more stupidity, or bêtise, as Stiegler calls it. Point 5 would be about, Kropotkin will talk about the invention to liberate. That would be an invention to liberate all. And that would mean a different kind of mechanical progress. Now, contrast that with someone like Stiegler, who's worried that the technological revolution we are going through means a robot revolution, means that more and more people are going to be thrown onto the streets, are going to be without knowledge and skills. And what does that mean for society as such? So then point 6 would be a question of why invent? Kropotkin would say that invention would be we must have new inventions to create a new society. Now, Stiegler is troubled by this and saying that we have a real problem with the idea of invention, and what does that mean? And he calls this possibility, a very faint possibility, is a negentropic knowledge, which is to say it's a resistance to entropy. So you could say we have too much information, too much addiction to our search engines. But there is a possibility, a very faint possibility of negentropic knowledge or knowledge creation as such. Now, again, point 7 will be about philosophers and who are these people who think, and they too must invent. Kropotkin says they must think the revolution again. Anarchism, socialism, communism, whatever you want to say, philosophers have a job to imagine the new society. And in our time, that's incredibly difficult. But Stiegler would say that even though, again, this incredibly difficult possibility of thinking the new form of society, but we must try to live. This is from Paul Valéry. That means we must care. That we must think. Thinking is penser en penser. It's to think is to care is to think. And he has this word bifurcate from science. A bifurcation is kind of a possibility of something new coming into the world. He says that we must be crazier than the disruption, the technological disaster we're living through. We must think beyond the search engines, beyond calculation. We must invent beyond that. And what do we invent, though? That's the question. But point 8 would be the critique of the 19th century and 20th century in Kropotkin. That would be the critique of the entropic steam engine of capitalism, the James Watt's invention of the steam engine. That's a total disaster. What are these mechanical machines we created which enslave billions of people? And Stiegler in our time would be asking about the eternal return in Nietzsche. And Nietzsche's idea of the eternal return is a resistance to the steam engine. That idea, philosophical idea, a new idea, would be a new kind of negentropic knowledge. It would be something which resists this kind of slowing down of the world, an entropic entropic tendency of the world. I think Kropotkin, in some ways, he shares something in that, looking for this idea of invention, a new way of getting ourselves out of the mess that we're in. Again, point 9 would be the corruption as a plea to young people, a corruption of corruption. The idea of invention would make something for all people available to all people, and that's the anarchist spirit. So all belongs to all, a society of all for all. It's very important. That's something that's stuck with me for nearly 40 years now. That would be a corruption in Stiegler's sense. That would be a resistance to the order of things by inventing what he calls against the global war of all against all. That would be, again, I think he shares with Kropotkin the idea of making a society of all for all. And his antidote, would be to think, to care, and that would be to expose oneself to the vulnerability that occurs when you have a relationship with the other. And in that way, one begins to live. So I think in that way, Stiegler and Kropotkin have much to say to each other in some way. Right, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joff. Okay, so we can go to the last presentation for this session. Meanwhile, don't hesitate to ask a question in the chat. We are already collecting some questions for later. So, Tomas Pewton is presenting about mutual aid, an alternative to power. Please, Tomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Federico. I'll just load up my presentation. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So, as stated, my talk is called Mutual Aid, an Alternative to Power. And the motivation behind the work is that as a philosophy student, we learn about many social critiques, but the problem is that they fail to offer any alternative or answer to what they are critiquing, and they ultimately end in pessimism. So the hope is that by bringing Kropotkin's theory of mutual aid in, we can escape such pessimism and offer an answer and alternative. And I particularly focus upon Michel Foucault's notion of power. So the work can be seen as a dialogue between Foucault's notion of power and Kropotkin's theory of mutual aid. And I first have to show how they can both fit into the same framework. So the novelty of Foucault's power is that it's no longer an entity that is held by a person or group, but instead it is spread throughout the social body. It's something that's active, and we find in relationships. So we can no longer study the church, the bourgeois, or the state, but we must look at where these relations are. Who is it exercised over? What techniques does it use? What are the effects of these, and what are the aims? And he gives a history of power, which we're going to see in the next slide. And from this are revealed its key characteristics: discipline, domination, authority, and normalization. So like Foucault, Kropotkin also gives a history of mutual aid, and from this we also realize that it's found throughout the social body. It's something that's active. It's a relationship that we all find ourselves involved in, and he too studies its techniques, relations, effects, and aims. And from its history, we also realize its key characteristics, this being cooperation, support, enthusiasm, sacrifice, and solidarity. So from this, straight away, we see the similarities between the two. They're both found everywhere. They're both happen in a relationship. It's not possible to hold it, but it's active. Both can also be described as an evolutionary trait, and neither can explain everything. So Foucault solely focuses on power, tries to explain everything through power. But by bringing them both together, we can offer a much more satisfactory view, explanation of a society's development, institutions, and the relationship we find in these. So I'm first going to go through the history of power, which, and I specifically focus on 3 books here. So we've got The History of Sexuality, Discipline and Punish, and Madness and Civilization. And Foucault traces power all the way back to the 15th century with something that he calls pastoral power. And the relationship that occurs here is between the individual and God, who's represented by the church. Techniques that are used are things such as confession, so we see how this is very personal, one-to-one relationship, and also the scriptures. And these create effects such as behavioral norms, they create moral codes, and the individual abides by these with the aim of reaching salvation in the next life. But another novelty of Foucault's power is that it's always transforming, it's always mutating to suit society's needs. So with the fall of the church and the rise of the monarchy in the 18th century, we see power mutate into something that Foucault calls sovereign power. Now the aim is no longer salvation in the next life, but it's simply to reinforce the sovereign's bloodline, its strength and rights. And the relation now becomes between the subject in relation to the sovereign family. And to create this aim, new techniques are used. So we see things as the creation of its own law. Things such as torture. So torture is always done in public squares. And if you see someone being tortured, you're less likely to revolt. And therefore this reinforces the sovereign strength and bloodline. And Discipline and Punish is worth reading by itself just for the graphic illustrations and first-hand accounts it gives of this torture. But with the fall of the monarchies and the rise of the bourgeois, we see power mutate once again. And now this aim is no longer to protect one family's bloodline, but it aims at economic efficiency. And as this rests upon a labour force, torture will no longer suffice, for this harms the labour force. So instead of torture and harm to the social body, we see things such as the prison and the police force, and this aims at controlling them. And we see the growth once again, so it changes from a subject in relation to a small centralised sovereign family to the whole social body. And this spread and growth of power continues once again into the 20th century and into the modern day. We see power spread throughout the social body. We see it spread into things such as medicine, in schools, and in sexuality. If you don't contribute to the economic efficiency and political satisfaction, such as homosexuals, you're not contributing to the ever-growing labour force that capitalism rests upon. You're going to be seek to be marginalised with the aim of normalisation, so you do contribute. But a problem with this history of power is that Foucault only traces it back to the 15th century. So what happens before this? The only inkling that we get from Foucault is the link he makes with evolutionism, which can serve as another bridge between Foucault and Kropotkin. But as we know, Kropotkin traces the history of mutual aid right back to the animal kingdom and into our earliest ancestors. And I'm sure we're all familiar with Kropotkin's history of mutual aid, and we've spent a lot of time in this conference talking about it, so I'll go through this a bit faster. But we learn in the book Mutual Aid: A Factor of Evolution that the majority of species live in societies based on mutual aid. It's the best tool for safety, the provision of food, enjoyment, and the rearing of children. And as we too are simply animals, the same advantages apply to us. And we see this in things such as parental care. We see that isolation is impossible and we depend upon the community. Going into the formation of villages and towns, we once again see how mutual aid is the most beneficial. It helps towards the founding of social institutions, the building of city walls, the building of roads and canals, the development of mass farming, the formation of knowledge. This is not possible if we're all involved in power relations, or as Hobbes calls it, the war of all against all. And going into cities and what would have been modern examples for Kropotkin, he continues to give examples of mutual aid in guilds, family, friendship, and also organisations such as the Red Cross, the English Lifeboat Association, and in Conquest of Bread he talks a lot about free agreements, the everyday transactions that happen in society, and also hobbyist associations. And now after this history of both factors, we can actually look at the relationship that has occurred between the two. As we've just seen in the animal kingdom and our earliest human ancestors, mutual aid is the most dominant. It's the driving force behind these relationships. It's the best for reproduction, the provision of food, safety, and enjoyment. But here we see how both are always evident and how both can help to explain the relations that we all find ourselves in. So in the animal kingdom, we see the competition in the struggle of life, the competition between species. The same in our earliest human ancestors, we saw how mutual aid was the most beneficial, how we depended on mutual aid. It was the dominant driving force behind us. But we can also see power here in things such as tribal warfare, the competition between species. And it can also be argued that we see the beginnings of pastoral power in things such as mysticism and the early roots of religion, which place knowledge and authority into the hands of the few. And both writers tend to agree that it's around the 15th, 16th century where we really begin to see a decrease in mutual aid relations and increase of power relations. And this is because mutual aid is so successful that it actually causes a population explosion. And this in turn fuels migratory wars. It fuels power relations in that we decrease in the communal bonds. We can no longer have a say in everyday matters, and the community feeling disappears because there's simply too many people. And this continues into modernity, where the centralization and privatization of wealth, resources, law, knowledge, history has continued, and where now individualism obviously reigns, where power relations have become more dominant. But going back to why we need two, this is only possible in the first place because of the advantages that mutual aid delivers. So after showing this history, I've also got to show how both are still prevalent today. I'm saying they're both the driving force behind the society. And Foucault always focuses on blocks to illustrate power. So he focuses on medicine, sexuality, our penal system. And influenced by Kropotkin, of course, I look at the most important block that is going to be of any society, and this is the block of food. I remember that we must look at the action, so this will be the production of food, the sales of food, the consumption of food. We must look at the relationship that occurs, and this is between producer and consumer, and also the aim. So as power is so dominant, we must look at what is the norm, but also the aim is political and economic efficiency. So how is this made possible? And I believe two traits of our food industry that display this comfortably are our use of livestock and also the accumulation of waste. So both of these can be considered the norm because the majority of diets around the world include meat. And there's a great book by Tristram Stewart called Waste, Uncovering the Global Food Scandal. He's pictured here in the middle picture. And from his research, he concludes that between 30 to 50% of all our food is wasted. So once again, we see how this is the norm. And these help to create the aim of political and economic efficiency because the abundance, the variety, and the cheapness of our meat, they all go towards the political satisfaction, they contribute towards the economy. We only have to remember a couple of years ago, if anyone's listening from England, that the KFC ran out of chicken, and it was front page news. It was the headline of the news at 6. And so any food crisis, on a more serious note, of course, causes political destability. And once again, waste is fueled by the need for the abundance, the variety. And here we see techniques of power evident again with law. So food must be a certain aesthetic as size. So the picture in the middle is a picture of bananas that are wasted because they're the wrong size. And this is from a banana plantation in Ecuador, which of course we know is a well-developed or underdeveloped or third world country. So we see how as soon as food does not contribute to the aim of political satisfaction, it's discarded. There's no use for it. And we also see how these power relations come from below. We're all involved in them. So, for example, we go to the supermarkets. The picture at the top is from a sandwich supplier of a supermarket, and it makes economic sense for them to waste. The profit margins on these sandwiches can be up to 100 times. So it's better for them to sell one and waste 90 than not to sell any at all. And once again, here we see the dominance of power relations over mutual aid. The food industry, just as the prison, it doesn't care about the well-being for all. The prison was supposed to be about rehabilitation. From Foucault's study, we learn it's about control. And here again, we see that in the food industry. It's not about feeding people. It's not about the well-being of all, but it's simply concerned with political and economic efficiency. And we must also show the effects of power that are happening in our society. And I believe one of these is the awakening of Gaia. And Gaia is the personification of Earth as a self-regulating being. And it's the idea that the Earth is awakening because of our destruction of her. And here again, we see the growth of power. So how it grew from a one-to-one personal relationship in pastoral power, then to between the subject and the social body, then to the population itself. It's now extended once again to include the Earth itself. And we see some techniques of power. So the middle picture is the Paris Agreement, and we see how laws are made. And it is focused, the same as the labour force, upon maximum productivity. We seek knowledge over this. We seek laws, the destruction of land ecosystems. And a big part of Foucault's power relations and of Gaia theory is the possibility of the reversal of power relations. So the sovereign reversed power relations over the church. And the sovereign was in turn reversed by the bourgeois, who was in turn reversed by the monarchy. By the government. So even though we're expressing power relations over the earth now, there's always this possibility of it reversing until the earth starts expressing power relations over us. And many Gaia theorists believe this is already happening. So things such as climate change, natural disasters. The bottom picture is an image released by the Met Office in the UK. We're suffering a heat wave here, and the Met Office released an extreme heat warning for the first time in its history. So Gaia theorists would use this as an illustration of this reversal of power relations. So once again, we've done a social critique, and we've simply reached pessimism. And the question is how to solve these problems that power creates. Kropotkin, of course, says revolution. Many Gaia theorists believe it's impossible. To Gaia, we are simply a piece of slime mold, and there's nothing we can do. The only hint that Foucault gives is that of resistance. And he would go on to develop something called as power as governmentality, and his escape from power relations was simply that we as members of the community of the governed are obliged to show mutual solidarity with the aim of not being governed as much. So this is another reason to bring in Kropotkin. Foucault's only answer for how to escape power relations is don't get involved with power relations. So we see the reason to bring in another well-developed theory, how we can escape this pessimism. And we can see, such as we saw power in action today in our food industry, we can see this resistance in things such as food banks. There's organizations here that I don't really have enough time to go in, but we can see organizations in our food industry that are based on mutual aid. On the top's a group called Guerrilla Kitchen Waste. They help redistribute food. On the bottom is a group called A Seed. This is a food festival they organise where they're campaigning against the destruction. They do things such as soil composting workshops. At the bottom we see food banks. Of course, these are concerned with the well-being of all. These are exilic spaces, as Andrei Grubicic and Dennis O'Hearn summarised so lovely in the presentation yesterday. But the problem is that many of these organisations, because of the dominance of power, they're marginalised and they're simply reactive. And the criticism is that they're simply helping to support power relations. They're picking up the others, as Foucault calls them, who are dismissed by power relations, who don't contribute. So in a way, they're actually supporting power relations. So another way to escape this is through a contemporary debate about Foucault's theory of power, which discusses the primacy of resistance. And although this is a very undeveloped field in Foucault's notion of power at the minute, it comes from, there's only one direct quote that he made of it, and that was in a TV interview where he says this quote here, he says, if there was no resistance, there would be no power relations. So resistance comes first, and is the main word, the key word in this dynamic. But of course, we saw how undeveloped his theory of resistance is. So by bringing in something like mutual aid, we have an alternative to base our resistance upon, and we can see it as a primary and reactive driving force behind social relations. And we saw this primacy in the historical analysis that we've gone through already. And I'm going to be giving a talk next month at another Kropotkin conference called 100 Years With and Without Kropotkin Conference, which is going to be discussing this primacy of mutual aid in practice today. And that's with a food cooperative I'm currently involved with in London called Organically. So you're welcome to join that if that sounds interesting. But the whole point is that we now have an escape from the pessimism, an answer to the problems that a social critique has given. And I quote Kropotkin here where he says, the mutual aid tendency in man has so remote an origin, is so deeply interwoven with all the past evolution of the human race, that it has been maintained by mankind up to the present time, notwithstanding all the vicissitudes of history. So Kropotkin's mutual aid therefore offers an escape from the pessimism, an answer to the problems that it proves. And just as we saw power grow, we once again need to will mutual aid again. I quote Kropotkin again where he says, from the clan it was extended to the stem, to the federation of stems, to the nation, and finally, in ideal, at least to the whole of mankind. And with the awakening of Gaia, we've seen the sort of the dead end of power. Capitalism depends on more ever growth. And if that reversal happens, as many people will argue it's happened, there's no more growth it can do. Unless we're a Jeff Bezos or a Richard Branson, we can go destroy another planet, which I doubt is very likely for anyone watching this conference. We need to see a switch to mutual aid relations. So in mutual aid, we find an answer and optimism in both theory and practice. And we've seen how it's evident in our history. We've seen how it's evident today. And in our every single breath, we're a part of God. You know, we see mutual aid, every breath we take is part of Gaia and ourselves. We've evolved with this ecosystem. And that is the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and again to everybody for the linguistic effort and overall for the fantastic 3 presentations. So I think that we have already a certain number of questions for the presenters. I ask, meanwhile, the public not to hesitate to ask other questions in the chat. Feel free to ask anything. Don't be shy. So I have first, I would say a couple of questions for Sam. So the first presenter, the first one from Adriano Skoda. Sam, how do you think Kropotkin's ideas dialogue to the behaviorist theory? And the second from Peterson Roberto da Silva, again for Sam. Kropotkin seems concerned with the origins of pro-social behavior and defending it. But does he talk about the origin of antisocial behavior? Do these merely appear at random, festering if unchecked, or is there a deeper logic to their emergence within any given context? Sam, would you like to respond to these questions?
Yeah. So I'll start with a question about behaviorism. For those who are not aware of what behaviorism is, it's a school in ethology and studying animal behavior and in studying psychology as well. And the origins of behaviorism, as I understand it, have a sort of scientific logic to them, where the idea behind behaviorism is that since we don't have, at least certainly not at that time, the tools to understand the interior mental states of animals, like their interior life, what they might actually be thinking. All we have to study are their behaviors, the things that we can measure, the things that we can track. These external features of the animal is these only things that we can understand, scientifically speaking. And so there's a sort of positivist, like logical, scientific reasoning behind that, right? But behaviorism has also sort of became over the course of its history much more nefarious. And I think the main reason for that is behaviorism, because it says, well, we cannot see inside of animals, so we're not going to speculate about it, ends up giving people the idea that, well, because we cannot have any scientific knowledge of what's going on in animals' heads, clearly nothing is going on in animals' heads. As in, behaviorism goes from saying what we're not able to say from that sort of statement to this sort of much stronger and, to my mind, sort of ridiculous idea that, well, since we can't discuss it scientifically, it must not exist. And this, I think, has historically lent itself to viewing animals as much less than animals, as less than organisms, as something very, very machine-like. And then that idea of animal behavior later gets interpreted into interpretations of human behavior and the application of behaviorism to humans. That is, we take this sort of idea that, well, animals are just machines that are following rules, that are built to act a certain way to achieve evolutionary, some sort of fitness, to pass on their genes. That's all they are, these machines with no sort of like internal life, emotion, anything like that. That's verboten. And then if you understand animals like that, it's not a far jump to start understanding human beings like that too. So I think while behaviorism had sort of a logic to it in the beginning of saying, this is what we cannot say, or this is what we can only speculate on, I think that, like, historically, that sort of limitation was reinterpreted rather creatively, and taken in a direction that Kropotkin would find pretty abysmal. So I do think he might favor sort of the earlier, or the reasoning behind the approach in the first place, of saying that, well, if we don't have the tools to access what's going on in their heads, then we'll simply not speculate. But even then, I think there is a role for sort of sympathy and reasoning by analogy, to be able to sort of understand like why animals might behave the way they do. And certainly, I think like this sort of idea of this sort of like almost infinite manipulability of the animal brain, which sort of is another extension through Skinner of behaviorism. This sort of idea that we can just sort of make an animal do whatever we want by making adjustments, and not thinking about like all of the internal structures and the internal whether they're there from genetic inheritance, or whether they're like acculturated in the animal, but all of these internal things that are going on in their head that make it sort of impossible to just for them to be a blank slate that you can sort of mold, as Skinner thought he could. Yeah, I think Kropotkin would also find that very suspicious. Now, as for the question about the origins of antisocial behavior, now Kropotkin doesn't really concern himself with just like finding what those origins are, but I don't think it's because he didn't think it was important. I think it was because he was writing in a context where the social Darwinist form of Darwinism already had a ready-made explanation for why anything happens really in society, which is that there's an evolutionary logic to passing on more copies of your genes, and there's competition to pass on more copies of your genes, and by hook or by crook you're going to like kill your enemies, or lie, cheat, steal, like backstab, whatever, to pass on more copies of your genes, and society or sociality is secondary to that. Now, Kropotkin, he says that we do have these tendencies to compete with each other for sure, and they very deep, like they run through all of the animal kingdom. But what he says, his idea of mutual aid, as a factor in evolution, is that it is a primary factor in evolution, and if anything is stronger than these competitive tendencies. Why? Because animal societies stick together, and the competition that happens in animal societies always happens within the limits of the animal society, as in like a chimpanzee who's trying to become the dominant male in his chimpanzee troop is not going to become the dominant male of the chimpanzee troop if it means the troop gets destroyed by his actions. That's a simple example, but I think if you look throughout nature, you'll see that there's many like varieties of this sort of like more subtle interaction going on, where there's a balance between these forces where individuals will try to have an edge over each other versus they need to keep their community together first of all. And I think Kropotkin was on the right track in saying that mutual aid is, if not the dominant tendency, at least an extremely important tendency, and one that in his context in Victorian era Europe was basically not regarded, because of the dominance of this social Darwinist view. So yeah, as to the logics behind it, I think there's the evolutionary logic that I mentioned. There's the logics that we could point to in our own historical time, like why have human societies become more violent over time? Why are we much more violent than we were as nomadic hunter-gatherers? I mean, we can speculate about that a lot, but that's just a question. But there seems to be a logic to it, and there seems to be well, there's also some like random things too that can happen. Like people can get diseases. They can get a tumor on their amygdala in their brain. It's just a random tumor can make you an extremely violent, aggressive person. There's also things like that. So there's random things, and then there's sort of logical reasons why there's antisocial behavior as well. And yeah, I'll leave it there, I suppose. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sam. So I know that there will be another couple of questions for you by Thomas over the microphone, but I think that it is better to finish now the first round of questions to all the presenters. Then we will come back to you and also to some general question for everybody. So I have a question for Joff by Adriano Skoda again. Joff at the article on the teaching of physiography, Kropotkin debates the methods of education and the importance of physical science to emancipate youth from prejudice. Do you think this still makes sense?
Well, I mean, the idea of prejudice, well, I would say, I would raise the question, what is the nature of education today? What is the role of the university today? And I wondered, I would wonder what Kropotkin would make of the state of educational institutions and the breakdown of educational institutions and the role of the teacher as a curator of knowledge. And I wonder that given the fact that there's a dominance of a STEM science directed education, that in fact it's not the right question to ask whether it's the physical sciences, it's the humanities which are in crisis. And I think Kropotkin would be concerned with the crisis of the humanities, and that raises the prospect of what the human is to become. So I think the idea of elevation, of sublimation, of Klarung, of enlightenment, would be a question for the humanities rather than the physical sciences. That would be, you could say, and just to refer to Thomas's kind of concern with Gaia, there's something else to observe, and that's the question of the biosphere. I was thinking about both Sam's talk as well, and the question of Nietzsche and the will to power and things like that, but that maybe I can come on to that. But the idea of the biosphere, you could turn to someone like Vladimir Vernadsky. And Vladimir Vernadsky is writing in the 1940s, after he came up with the idea of the noosphere. Noosphere would be like the layer upon the earth of human knowledge as such, you could call it like that, right? Now that idea seems to me to resonate with Kropotkin. I mean, Vernadsky was a Russian scientist, okay? And a very well-respected Russian scientist. Now, what he says is so interesting. He says that humans have kind of added to the geological history of the planet by organizing life as such. Now, this organization of life as such is at the local level, okay? Now, that seems to me, to be a question of mutual aid, how life would organize to resist the kind of entropic direction of the universe. So life organizes itself. It adds to the geosphere. So it's not, forgive me, Thomas, but I don't think it's not a question of Gaia having a will against like a pestilence of the humans. It's not that. It's humans organizing at the local level to kind of give life a kind of life becomes a resistance to the kind of the kind of closed nature of the universe. So it's something different going on there. I don't forgive me, but I don't think that there's a kind of consciousness to the earth like someone like Teilhard de Chardin, who shares a history of the noosphere with Vernadsky. Teilhard de Chardin sees the elevation of the noosphere somehow becoming the omega point where we become this higher state of consciousness, something like this, right? I don't think it's like that, but the physical science would, So you see, anyway, this great question, and I don't want to take up people's. We should hear some questions for Thomas as well. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyway, I think that there may be some interesting discussion dynamics among the presenters, so we can take this for after the round of questions. There is also a general question that I think can go to everybody by Toru Oda, so I think that it can go last. There is a remark of Peterson Roberto da Silva for Tomas that looks exactly more like a remark than a question, but you can consider, Tomas, if you wish to respond. So Peterson writes that Foucault's theory of power is not actually that novel. Anarchists has been saying the same thing for a long time. David Tuley's argument in Anarchist Studies number 20, volume 26 is forceful in that sense. Still, a nice dynamics is sketched out here with mutual aid as a creative force of resistance. Do you have any response to that, Thomas?
Yeah, I totally agree with Peterson. This project was actually my master's thesis, so it was built in the world of academia, where, as we know, anarchist theory, well, from my own experience, maybe not from everyone else's, but it's sort of frowned upon and not taken as scientific or academic. So it was hoped by grounding Kropotkin in a Foucauldian framework that pretty much my supervisors would take it more seriously, I suppose. But yeah, I totally agree. I wanted to ground Kropotkin in a academic world.
Okay, something that can be a practical need for some endeavors. Did you have any questions for Sam, you said?
Yeah. Hello, Sam. Thanks for your presentation. I was wondering if you've heard of the writer, I might be pronouncing it wrong, he's French, Etienne de la Boite. I can copy and paste his name into the chat. He's a 16th century French writer, and he talks about mutual aid. He calls it natural companionship. So when you're talking about Rousseau and how the whole of nature is pretty much the Hobbesian view, war of all against all, he gives a different view of this. But my question was that you talked about the ethics behind science, and I was wondering how you would explain that about so nuclear warfare, the current race to space we see today between billionaires, also colonialism, where science was used to justify colonialism. So I see no ethics behind science here. That's immorality behind science.
I mean, I would totally agree with you. If we take science to mean like everything that falls under the rubric of science, anything that anyone's done that's been called scientific, then no doubt that science has been pretty horrible in many ways. I mean, more than you've pointed out. I mean, like, you know, for scientific purposes, putting people in insane asylums and treating their diseases in very scientific ways, which amounted to torture, you know, and human experimentation. I mean, those things, you could call them science. I suppose what I was getting at, though, at least for the context of this presentation anyway, was Kropotkin's idea of what science was as an ethical project. This sort of ethics that would inform the science that Kropotkin would consider licit, I suppose. Not simply accumulating knowledge, but in a sense, having these sort of values behind it. Something that I think was sort of taken for granted. I mean, I put it in there. It's not something that he explicitly talks about very much. It's something that I take more from Bakunin's writings on science, but I think was actually just common among a certain milieu of just progressive or radical thinkers of the 19th century, of seeing it as this very revolutionary Promethean force, something that could like change the world for the better in myriad ways by overturning existing hierarchies. Now, yeah, I would certainly agree that like science as such, and if we include all those other things, has a much more complicated legacy and a brutal legacy in many cases. So I would not want to say that like, hey, science good all the time. No, I just want to say that science good for some things, and those things that science was good for were things that Kropotkin was very much about, and things that he wanted to do. I mean, directions he wanted science to go in. I think that's what I'd say. Now, maybe we just should redefine terms and start like calling things by different names and having a word for the sort of like the sort of orientation to knowledge that like I'd call this sort of Kropotkin science versus like science in general. Because is it the same thing if like say a corporation is studying something secretly and has no intention to like publish its results? Is that science really? Like discovering something in secret, which is how a lot of science gets done today, is at odds with the idea of science where it's a common good, or at least a common thing, common knowledge, making things common knowledge. I think that's part of the idea of science that Kropotkin has, is that it's something where it is this common thing, where it takes place for everyone, for the sake of the world, for the sake of human understanding, rather than to get an edge on a competitor or to develop a new smart bomb to destroy the enemy before they can catch it. Whatever. Maybe we should just define these as different things entirely, because they have these sort of different ethical orientations, these sort of different ways of being part of the world or not being part of the common world and being sort of for one's own personal gain, or even being world destroying. That could be its own category. But yeah, I'm very alive to criticism of science, of scientism, of that sort of thing, and that's a point well taken. I want to emphasize for everyone listening that when I say science good in Kropotkin is what I mean. That's all.
Thank you, Sam. So I have a general question by Toru Oda, who wrote to Sam, but probably to the other panelists. So I am reading the question and then let's see who wants to reply. My question is somewhat related to Peterson's. Do you think Kropotkin is concerned with the origin of mutual aid? It seems to me that Kropotkin began mutual aid by talking about the animal kingdom, but kept talking about how mutual aid went beyond the biological social limits and expanded further. I am not saying that it is unnecessary to find between quotes scientific evidence to support the first half of mutual aid. I am just wondering how much biological and intuitive is Kropotkin's idea of mutual aid? How much invented, creative is it, or should it be? So, who wants to react?
I can give a quick.
You want to go first?
If you want. So I was going to say that. So as we saw with Foucault, he only takes power back to the 15th century. I don't think it's ever going to be 100% certain that we can trace mutual aid as the first driving force behind social relations or anything like that. So yeah, that was also my little snippet. Nothing's 100% certain at all. So I don't think he's concerned about it very much at
all. Yeah, I believe that his understanding was that he was, among other things, figuring out why mutual aid even exists. Like why we as organisms do this thing where we take care of each other in various contexts. I think he was definitely interested in explaining that, and explaining that in a Darwinian fashion, like according to his understanding of Darwinian science at the time. And I think he did a pretty good job for his time, and that we've basically only expanded on that knowledge further. So the other part of your question, might not be understanding it quite right, as to whether mutual aid could be more biologically instinctive or intuitive and instinctive, or invented / creative. So, I mean, this is complicated. I could take it from different angles, basically. I do think that Kropotkin is identifying what you could call biological realities, or like actual instincts that we have, that animals have, and that we act on. But not just instincts as well, because organisms can also learn things, not things that we inherit or things that we like have instinctually in us, but we can learn things from each other. And those can be forms of mutual aid, especially in people like human beings like us, where learning is one of the main ways that we acquire our behaviors. We have many, many more behaviors than other animals because we learn them. So it's not that mutual aid is exclusively biological or instinctive, though I would say that all organisms, almost all organisms, certainly ourselves and things related to us, do have very deeply rooted instincts of mutual aid. Those exist. Now, on the other hand, on the idea of uncovering, describing mutual aid, which is Kropotkin's project, I think that there's also room there, and this might have been your question in the first place, this is why I wasn't clear. I think there's also room there for creativity. Because on the one hand, though, we do want to like describe the world as accurately as possible, as succinctly as possible, and to have some sort of come to sort of a common truth, something that's probably not open to interpretation or creativity when we do sort of science about the natural world. We want to like come up with things that are facts about the world that are more or less like unimpeachable. That's an idea. At the same time, there's creativity involved in how one goes about doing that. There's creativity involved in how one expresses oneself once one's done that. His books, which are written for popular audiences, is one example of the creativity involved there. And then you can go even further. I mean, he was a passionate fan of Goethe, the German poet, and his poetry on nature. You could go even further. I mean, poetry on the subject of mutual aid. If I put it that way, it sounds pretty dry, but if you read a lot of poetry, you'll probably find mutual aid in there if you're looking, because it's something that we humans deeply care about. And yeah, much of our creative endeavors are informed by it. So it's both and, for sure.
Can I have a go to explain? No, I've thought about it. I think as Sam said, you could say that Kropotkin is concerned with like uncovering kind of, the origins of mutual aid in a way, but we could call it a kind of genealogy of mutual aid, because Tomas kind of suggested that Kropotkin was somehow thinking between Nietzsche and Kant. Okay, so that got me to think about the explanation that Tomas gave about the genealogy of morality. So I don't kind of see the reading that Tomas gave. I don't see that. I think Nietzsche would be someone concerned with the psychology of ideal types. Like slave morality is not the history of morality of slavery as such. It's the history of it's not resentment, it's ressentiment, something quite different. It's a psychological analysis that Nietzsche undertakes. I believe, regarding the bad conscience and regarding the kind of what can you say, the aristocratic mode of evaluation and things like that. So my idea about that would be, if you could say that Kropotkin's undertaking a genealogy of mutual aid. It's not, the social biological arguments are all there, as Sam brilliant explained about in the animal kingdom, about how animals protect themselves in crowds, right? By the movement. You can see birds flying, how they protect themselves. And that's, I think it's pretty well established that, but that something else is going on there in the question of mutual aid, and that's the question of creativity. And creativity, I think, in terms of mutual aid, is not an origin of like our social biological origins. It's not that question. It's a mutual aid is a kind of elevation above that, and we just have to account for the difference in our species. The fact that I'm using technology to speak to you from thousands of miles away means that we have elevated it beyond our animal beyond our animal natures. One has to account for that use of technology. Now that is where the idea of mutual aid would have that creative impulse. You would say. So that the gentleman is a Oda-san desu ka? Yeah. So that's right. There is something there, but I think Kropotkin is looking for something other than that to think about humanity as such. And it's out of fashion now to talk about humanity, where post-human or transhuman kind of obsessions abound, but humanity is in crisis, and I think Kropotkin would be concerned about this, and would look to something like mutual aid to account for that struggle against the kind of the abuses of power. And again, Thomas, I don't actually agree with your reading of Foucault. I don't think it's not one cannot escape power relations. Foucault would be the first to say that. There would be his kind of microphysics of power would be of what he's interested in. And the question, I think, in the chat, I think it's wrong. I think Foucault's intervention in power to give a reinterpretation is quite different than the anarchists. Anarchists would see power as inherently a question of corruption. And Foucault says, no, that's not how we should understand power. We must use power we should see how it flows through us in this microphysics. We should learn how to use it in a more productive way. So I think there's some kind of maybe errors in that interpretation. So resistance is fine. It's okay to resist, but that doesn't mean escape from power. It's a form of escape, you could say, but it's not. One cannot escape power. That's something quite different. Foucault makes an intervention in the history of intellectual thought, and in that respect, I think. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So, Thomas, I know that you had first a question to Joff. Now I think that you may continue anyway the conversation.
So yeah, Joff, I just want to reply to your last remark saying that I totally agree that power is always evident. The whole point of my work was to show how both are always evident. We're never going to escape power. But maybe this is a discussion to have another time. And the question I was going to ask, the main point of my work was also to look for optimism. And you mentioned Greta Thunberg as a place where we can see the corruption of youth. So can you give me much more optimism? Where can we see this corruption of corruption?
Well, that's my idea is according to Stiegler's kind of view, he offers a kind of very bleak reading of the history of techne or history of technology, and his pharmacology, his kind of understanding of technology as both a poison and a cure, right? Going back to Plato, right? Now, the two examples I gave, Florian, he sees despair everywhere and can't find a path beyond that. I know with climate change and discussion about the Anthropocene, things like that, people see kind of some cataclysm approaching or something like this. And that's, you know, as you said, the historic moment with the Met Office and the you know, the weather patterns in the UK, right? But then someone speaks to power like Greta Thunberg, okay, takes on the entire United Nations and says, how dare you give the youth of today this world through the exploitation of natural resources, which began in the Industrial Revolution, let's say, right? Now, Thunberg, this little girl, you know, she speaks to adults and embarrasses them, and I mean, you know, she's not a new Christ. I don't mean it like that. I'm not looking for a savior, but she speaks. It's an act of parasia. She is parasia, a modern day parasia to you. She takes a risk, and you know, she death threats on the internet from, you know, vested interests. Don't want people to tell them that the way that they organize and exploit natural resources is wrong. Now that daring to speak is like Kant. Okay, it's dare to use your reason. So that is the optimism. If you want to use that language, it is use your reason to account for the order of the world and to offer an alternative as a consequence. And even someone like Stiegler, even someone like Felix Guattari, they suffered from all kinds of kind of depression and the kind of pessimism. But even those kind of thinkers saw a moment of possibility, a moment to kind of, it's not a question of resistance. It's funnily enough, the language, I hear a lot of questions about resistance. So it's not resistance, it's invention. It's invention, if you want technical tools, or it's philosophical tools. It's a new form of negentropic knowledge. It's knowledge that we have to go back, as Stiegler says, to the base of knowledge. That's where we begin again. And I think Kropotkin, to be fair, would, you know, you could imagine him saying something quite similar. So that is the, if you want to use the language of optimism, fine, but that is the kind of the hope, if you want. It's not a question of hope. Hope is, Spinoza would hate the question of hope. It's not that. It's a question of invention. And that is where you find some kind of, life is resistance to the entropic nature of the universe. So that's the invention. That's what we have to return to, the base of knowledge. I'm not sure I answered your question, but never mind.
No, thank you. That's fine.
Okay, thank you very much. I found also among the many interesting notions discussed in this session, I found also very interesting, Joff, that you mentioned several times the idea of paresia, so which is a word coming from ancient Greece, and a notion that was also developed a lot by Foucault among other philosophers, and that can be associated with all philosophies which have some idea of individual insubordination, individual freedom, ethical stances facing the power, etc., etc. So could be also interesting to work one day on what can be an anarchist history of paresia, or how this can be variously associated with anarchism, even traveling under different names. I think that we don't have any further questions from the public, but as we still have a few minutes, if there are any final remarks from the presenters.
It was great hearing from you.
Nervous kind of silence, right?
I don't think 10 minutes. I don't think 10 minutes is long enough.
Well, I thought you guys had much to say to each other regarding Nietzsche. I thought you guys had a kind of dialogue that you could really kind of get into
If we got into Nietzsche, we could be here for hours. As far as I could talk about Nietzsche forever. I really.
Right. Well, that'd be wonderful to see the Nietzsche and Kropotkin worked on in that way. You know, thinking about that would be. I just felt like you were somehow communicating with each other. You had a dialogue in the making there.
I mean, speaking for myself, since my presentation was on Kropotkin's ethics, I mean, I read Genealogy of Morals alongside it as I was going. I mean, I must have flipped through it like a dozen times by this point, because I mean, they just go well together. I mean, on the one hand, there's Kropotkin explaining ethics, origin and development. Where does it come from? And then Nietzsche, he's explaining where it comes from. As I said in my presentation, Nietzsche's pretty far off base, but he's off base in an interesting way. And he's a fascinating thinker. And he's also a more subtle thinker than some people give him credit for. I mean, it's not that he is opposed to ressentiment as a force in history. He doesn't think that it was just like this bad thing that happened and that we just need to have master morality again.
No.
Nietzsche is much more interesting than that. He's aware of how much better history has become because it's had ressentiment, because it's had this deepening power. That's given more meaning to life on Earth by raising these questions.
You mentioned something like in Nietzsche, you mentioned pure sadism of Nietzsche or something like that, and that kind of concerned me because Nietzsche was petrified that the society of his time was being riven, torn to bits by the kind of the bad conscience of the anarchists, right? I mean, he was terrified that this world that he could see was just, was suffering a kind of devastating sense of nihilism. So I wasn't quite sure about the idea of pure sadism. I don't find that. I think he's, I didn't see that.
I take him at his word in a lot of places as to what he thinks is wrong, and he describes it as mollycoddling, at least in my translation in many places, mollycoddling of humanity, or as us becoming, the last man, right? This sort of weak, self-hating thing, and that all of these sort of like feelings of guilt or concern for the weak and these things like that are just weighing on us so much, whereas we should be free and active and seize history, like Napoleon did, or like Caesar did. Like, those are the great individuals of history that we should want to be, and if we're not them, then we should just get out of the way because they're the thing. I think Nietzsche is very much, he's kind of like the priest of the state in a way, but in a weird way because he's also against the state. I mean, in Zarathustra anyway, he has not nice things to say about the state, but he has a lot of admiration for these individuals who are at the top of the state, as great individuals. But the sadism, I think it's real. I think he really, I mean, in one place, he says that he thinks that the world was a much more cheerful place back when torturing your enemies was the normal thing to do. Back when people were just tortured all the time. Back when, warrior bands fighting each other would capture and torture each other. He thought it was a more cheerful world. That the torture wasn't looked upon the way we look upon it, as creatures of the society where we just moan over pain all the time. That it was taken in a different sense. So sadism, but also maybe in his mouth, sadism doesn't mean as ugly a thing that it might to all of his listeners, because he's actually, at least in his proposal of what the sadism means, it's not that bad in a weird way. But I don't follow him there, and I don't follow him there for anthropological reasons. I don't think human beings are this inherently violent, though in this world that's been created by the advances of technology, we have become so, and we have to grapple with that. What's the value of that? What's the value of being a warrior? I mean, this is a big question, I think, in Kropotkin that I wasn't really able to get into, and that I don't think he really had good answers for. But you know, mutual aid exists in an army. You know, it exists in a national socialist state, ostensibly, right? The Nazis took care of each other, or the German people, at least that was the idea, right? You know, mutual aid exists in all sorts of contexts where it's like in group only, out group, they're either an enemy or a vermin, something like that. So what accounts for saying no? Actually, I don't want to exterminate this or that race of person, or I don't think of other people as my enemies necessarily. Or in fact, I think of the working class around the world, as anarchists had it back then and have it today, as my brothers, and the enemy being the exploiter. These questions get a lot more thorny and complicated when we get into these sort of cultural forces and things that I unfortunately couldn't get into in my presentation. Things that are historical time, let's say, rather than the remote past, pre-historical societies, and you know, the animal world. History makes everything very different, but I think, that being said, there is reason to look outside of history, to nature, as it were, to understand who we are and what our ethics could be, and go on from there. And then the last thing I'll say is that ethics don't even have to be justified on some level, because you can just do what you think is right. You don't need to have reasons for it. But anyway, that's all.
Okay, given the time, I think that we can conclude with these Kropotkinian statements, and so I would like to acknowledge everybody in the panel for this fantastic discussion, to thank the public for their questions and their participation. So I hope to meet again everybody in something like half an hour when the next session starts. So thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Federico.
Goodbye.
Thank you, Sam.
Thanks.
Thank you, Joff.
Thank you. Thank you.